There's a cemetery near my house. It's old and quiet, with rows of crooked tombstones covered in moss. The iron gates creak every time the wind blows, and the trees surrounding the place are dark and twisted. For years I avoided it at night, but something changed recently. Something I still can't explain. It started one cold evening. I was walking home late, the sun just dipping below the horizon. My usual route took me past the cemetery, and that day, I felt the air grow colder as I approached. The sky was a deep purple, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. I told myself it was just my imagination, but a shiver ran down my spine anyway. As I walked past the gates, I heard something, a faint whisper, almost like a breath in the wind. I stopped and listened, but there was only silence. The air was still, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. I shook my head, trying to brush off the strange feeling creeping up on me, and hurried home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving in the cemetery, heard whispers in the dark. When I finally drifted off, I had nightmares. In my dreams, I was walking through the cemetery at night, the moon hanging low in the sky. The graves seemed closer together, the tombstones leaning toward me like they were watching. I felt something behind me, following me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the quiet, empty graveyard. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, but the feeling lingered. I could still hear the whispers, faint, but there, just on the edge of hearing. The next day, I avoided walking past the cemetery. I took the long way home, even though it added 15 minutes to my commute. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, they got worse. I would find myself back in the graveyard, walking among the graves, always hearing those whispers, but never seeing anyone. And always, there was that feeling of being watched, of something waiting just out of sight. After a week of sleepless nights, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to face whatever it was. Maybe if I went into the cemetery, it would stop haunting me. I had to know if the whispers were real or just in my head. It was a Friday night when I finally gathered the courage to go. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the gravestones. I took a deep breath and pushed open the iron gate, the creak of metal echoing through the night. The wind was cold, biting at my skin as I stepped inside. The cemetery was even quieter than usual. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I walked slowly, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The whispers started almost immediately, soft and indistinct, but definitely there. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they seemed to be coming from all around me. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. The deeper I went into the cemetery, the louder the whispers became. I looked around, but I was alone. The tombstones stared back at me, silent and cold. I could feel the presence of something nearby, something unseen, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was. Finally, I reached the center of the cemetery, where an old crumbling mausoleum stood. The whispers were louder now, almost like voices overlapping, but still too soft to understand. I approached the mausoleum, the air growing colder with each step. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, it was dark and musty. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. I took out my flashlight and shone it around the small room. The walls were lined with niches, each one holding an old coffin covered in dust. But what caught my eye was a small, open space in the center of the floor, like a shallow pit. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers were almost deafening now, swirling around me like a storm. I looked down into the pit and saw nothing. It was just an empty hole in the ground, no more than a few feet deep. But as I stared into it, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers stopped, and in the silence, I heard a voice. Clear, sharp, and right behind me. "Get out." I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been when I entered. But the feeling of dread didn't go away. It pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I stumbled back, almost falling into the pit, and ran out of the mausoleum as fast as I could. I didn't stop running until I was out of the cemetery, the gates slamming shut behind me. The whispers were gone, but the fear remained. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I haven't gone near the cemetery since. The nightmares stopped, but sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I can still hear the whispers. And every time, I remember that voice, warning me to stay away. I don't need to be told twice. When I got the job as a security guard at Rosewood Cemetery, I thought it would be easy money. The cemetery was old, and not many people visited it anymore. Most of the graves had been forgotten, their stones cracked and weathered by time. My shift was from midnight to 6 in the morning, and all I had to do was make sure no one trespassed or vandalized the property. The first few nights were quiet, almost boring. I would sit in the small security office near the entrance, watching the flickering monitors that showed the different parts of the cemetery. Sometimes I'd walk through the grounds, flashlight in hand, but there was never anything to see. Just row after row of old gravestones, their inscriptions barely readable. Then, about a week into the job, things started to change. It was a Friday night, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The wind had picked up, rattling the dead branches of the trees surrounding the cemetery. I was sitting in the office, sipping a cup of coffee, when I noticed something strange on one of the monitors. It was faint, just a flicker of movement near the far edge of the cemetery, where the oldest graves were located. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen. At first I thought it was just the wind blowing some leaves around, but then I saw it again, a shadow moving between the tombstones. It was too dark to make out any details, but it didn't look like an animal. It was too tall, too human. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a wall, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I made my way toward the back of the cemetery. The wind was howling now, making it hard to hear anything else. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but everything seemed normal. No movement, no shadows, just the silent, empty graves. As I turned to head back to the office, I heard something. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was there. A low, scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned back around, shining my flashlight toward the sound. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness and gravestones. But then, in the distance, I saw it, a figure, standing between two graves. It was tall and thin, its body draped in something that looked like tattered cloth. The light from my flashlight barely reached it, but I could see its face, pale and gaunt with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. For a moment, I thought about calling out to it, asking if it needed help, but something in the back of my mind told me not to. Something told me to run. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stood there for a long moment, my flashlight shaking in my hand, before finally turning and hurrying back to the office. I spent the rest of the night staring at the monitors, but the figure didn't appear again. By the time my shift ended, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I was more tired than I realized. Either way, I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to lose my job over something that might have been nothing. But then, the next night, it happened again. This time, it was closer. I was doing my usual rounds, walking through the cemetery, when I heard that same scraping sound. I turned, and there it was, the figure, standing just a few yards away from me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like I was frozen in place, trapped by its gaze. And then it spoke. The voice was barely a whisper, raspy and cold, like the wind itself. "Help me," it said. "Please help me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't move. I could only stand there, staring at the figure as it slowly began to move toward me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, but just as the figure was about to reach me, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and the figure vanished once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. I ran back to the office and locked the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the office, the monitors flickering in the background. I didn't go back outside. I didn't even look at the screens. I just sat there, waiting for my shift to end. When the sun finally rose, I quit my job. I didn't even bother to explain why. I just left the keys on the desk and walked out, vowing never to set foot in that cemetery again. But even now, months later, I can still hear that voice in my head, that raspy, desperate whisper. "Help me, please, help me." I tried to forget it, but I couldn't. Night after night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, that voice echoing in my ears. Then one night, I decided I had to know more. Maybe if I understood what was happening in that cemetery, I could put an end to it, once and for all. I began digging into the history of Rosewood Cemetery, searching through old records and archives. I learned that the far end of the cemetery, where I had seen the figure, had been part of an older burial ground from the 1800s. There were stories about that section, tales of unmarked graves and bodies buried in shallow pits. Some people even claimed that those buried there had been forgotten victims of a fire that had swept through the nearby town long ago. One name kept coming up in the old records: Mary Weaver. She had lived in the town when the fire happened and was believed to have perished in the blaze. But there was no record of her ever being properly buried. Some said her body was never found, while others whispered that she had been buried in one of those unmarked graves, without a proper headstone or ceremony. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure I had seen was connected to her, that maybe, somehow, Mary Weaver was still trapped in that graveyard, searching for peace. So one night, I went back. Armed with a shovel, I headed to the spot where I had seen the figure. The wind was still, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. I found the grave, a simple patch of dirt with no marker, and began to dig. It didn't take long to reach something. My shovel hit wood, and my heart skipped a beat. I knelt down, brushing away the dirt with my hands, revealing an old, rotting coffin. My hands trembled as I pried it open. Skeleton, brittle and decayed, wrapped in tattered cloth. There was no doubt in my mind that this was Mary Weaver. Her hollow eyes seemed to stare up at me, just as they had in the cemetery. But this time, I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange sense of calm, like I was finally doing something right. I whispered then carefully covered the coffin again. I made a promise to myself that I would get her a proper headstone, something to mark her place in the world, something to finally let her rest in peace. As I stood there, looking down at the freshly covered grave, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees. And for the first time in months, I didn't hear the voice. There was only silence, peaceful, comforting silence. I never returned to Rosewood Cemetery after that night, but I like to think that, wherever Mary Weaver is now, she's finally found the peace she was searching for.